Hello YouTube and welcome to an all new Elder Scrolls lore video. Today we're talking about the All Flags Navy, the largest navy ever seen in Tamriel's history. Now, this video contains a lot of the new lore from the new High Isle chapter of the Elder Scrolls Online gathered on a public test server before the official release of the High Isle chapter. So if you are someone who would like to do their own lore research, or you don't want to see screenshots of High Isle's environments because you want to discover it for yourself, I really recommend turning back now, as this video may contain spoilery material for you. If not, well, then let's talk about the All Flags Navy. So, starting around the year 2200 of the First Era, a terrible sickness ravaged over Tamriel, the so-called Thrassian Plague. This plague would kill over half of Tamriel's population, and as of today its origins are still unconfirmed in the lore. However, the people of Tamriel somehow became convinced that this plague had been engineered and sent upon them by the Slode. Again, there is no evidence for that in the lore, but we do know that the people of Tamriel believed it to be true, including, crucially, the Thrassian Emperor at the time and most of the rulers across Tamriel. Now, if you want to know more about the plague itself, I really recommend checking out my video on the topic. It's in the description of this video. I also made a video on the Slode race itself, which I recommend watching if you don't know who the Slode are. Anyway, the people of Tamriel and their rulers became convinced that it was the Slode, a race of sea slug-like necromancers living on the island archipelagos far west of Tamriel called Thrass, that they were the ones who had set the plague upon them, and this meant that once that Tamriel had somewhat recovered of the plague some 30 years after its start, it wasn't long when voices started to emerge calling for revenge upon the Slode and their islands. And no voice called louder for revenge than the King of Colovia, Baron of Anvil, Bendu Olo. He called for the creation of a gigantic fleet mustered from all the nations of Tamriel, a fleet which would sail west and kill every last Slode to walk on Nirn, and destroy their entire kingdom for what they had done to Tamriel. The Thrassian Emperor at the time agreed and called for every nation around Tamriel to assemble their fleets for this mighty attack, and King Bendu Olo was appointed Baron Admiral, leader of the operation and commander of the entire fleet. Almost every nation on Tamriel, from the kings of Somerset to the Argonian tribes, contributed their might to this effort. The shipyards of Tamriel worked around the clock to produce enough ships to hold the armies which would be sent. It took in all over 15 years for the entire fleet to be built and assembled, and in those 15 years the shipyards around Tamriel worked day and night, and oaths were sworn all around Tamriel to join the fleet once the attack on Thrass would commence. Baron Admiral Bendu Olo coordinated the assembly of the fleet from the Sistras archipelago. He had his base of operations on High Isle, which is where the next ESO DLC takes place. It was here that also many ships were built, and from here it was that the initial scouting parties were sent out to Thrass. In these years there were also minor skirmishes and fights between the Slode and the ships guarding the High Isle, but the Slode never outright attacked the assembling fleet, which was only in its construction phase at this point. Perhaps the Slode did not anticipate a massive attack on them, or they simply did not have the numbers to strike. Then finally, in the year 2260 of the First Era, the fleet was ready, and all those who'd sworn to come had assembled at the Sistras, and a large fleet, larger than any ever seen on Tamriel, was ready to depart. Each nation of Tamriel was represented, and several ships of pirates and mercenaries had even joined up as well to enact revenge and possibly loot Thrass together with the fleet. The fleet would become called the All Flags Navy, and under the command of Baron Admiral Olo and his flagship the Relentless, and the elvish mage Ciribane, who would come to assist the fleet set out for the Coral Kingdom of Thrass to lay complete waste to it. All of the participants of the fleet were excited as they sailed out, and for a brief moment in history almost everyone on Tamriel was united. But their good spirits would soon come to diminish, as the journal of one who sailed on one of the ships states that in just a few days' time, once they had entered the Sea of Pearls, which is where the Slode territory starts, the entire fleet was harassed by fierce storms which all carried a rotting stench in the air. Many on board the ships got something resembling seasickness and started puking, even the most experienced sailors who had never even had seasickness to begin with. And suddenly as the storms had begun, they stopped, and instead a mysterious mist engulfed the entire fleet. The sailors and captains couldn't see more than a few feet in front of their ships, and in the fog they heard cracks and screams coming from the other ships. Nobody knew what was happening at that point. Either the Sloth were attacking the ships stealthily one by one, or the fog was so dense that many ships sailed on the rocks. What was clear is that once the fog ended, once again as abruptly as it had started, they had lost many ships in the fog. Many men on the ships were demoralized and wished to turn back, but once the strange fog had subsided, they gazed upon the islands of the coral kingdom of Thrass and its gigantic coral tower at the center made out of blood-red coral, and they gazed upon the many Sloth on the beaches. They also saw a strange blue light at the apex of the tower, as if many Sloth mages were casting spells from the top of the tower, likely keeping the storms and the fog in its place. The men on the ships were struck in awe by the tower and the coral kingdom, but suddenly a projection of the Baron Admiral appeared on the decks of all the ships, and it commanded them to commence the attack. All the ships containing foot soldiers would land and slaughter as many Sloth as possible and lay siege to the coral tower, while the Imperial artillery ships would bombard the tower and the other buildings from a distance. Many Sloth were brutally slaughtered that day as the men of Tamriel landed on their shores. For a few hours the attack progressed, Sloth being slaughtered left and right, as the slugs are famously bad at physical combat. But then suddenly atop the coral tower the blue magical light began to pulse, and the ground of the islands of the kingdom of Thrass began to tremble. This was enough for most of the Tamrielic soldiers to start fleeing back to their landing boats, and it's good that they did, as after a while the islands of Thrass suddenly began to sink, as the water around it even started to boil. Less than half of the forces made it back to their landing boats before the islands began to sink, and when they did they saw that the coral tower was sinking as well. And as the mage light atop the tower reached the water during the sinking, a massive whirlpool formed where it had landed into water, which sucked in many ships of the fleet. Few were able to escape the whirlpool, which sucked the ships in and transported them to Cold Harbor, the Daedric plain of Molag Bal, which the Sloth had likely called upon in their hour of need. Most of the Imperial artillery ships seemed to have survived the ordeal, and together with a few ships which survived the massive whirlpool, they called upon a victorious retreat and they sailed back to Tamriel. When they returned to the Sisters Archipelago and High Isle, they were received as heroes, but over half of the armada had been lost, and thus for many it was a solemn occasion. On High Isle, the central isle was to become a dedicated monument to the fleet, where in the new DLC we can find All Flags Islet. While large parts of the islet are closed off in the public test server, I did get all the lore that's in there at the moment, and as with most of the other lore on High Island which is currently available, they may add more, in which case I might do a follow-up to this video or something. Anyway, I really hope that you enjoyed this video, and I really hope that you learned something. But before I end the video, allow me to say that I hope to see you again in the next Elder Scrolls lore video, and allow me to vocally thank my top Patreon supporters: Mr. Bernardo Binda, Slav Howard, Gabriel Binda, Polar Rasputin, Athena Hyotis, King Chris, Andrew Jordan, Doji, Fenrir, Sword of Bushido, Charm Mekal, and Mr. Christmas. It's thanks to these people and all the others on screen that this channel stays alive, and for that I'm very grateful. That said, I hope to see you all in the next Elder Scrolls lore video, hopefully with a less painful voice. Bye bye.